Boldwood presents Summer at the Twist and Turn Bakery. Written by Helen Rolfe and read by Gloria Sanders. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Boldwood. Chapter 1. Jade's thumping headache matched the thunder outside the cottage, and the way she felt this morning mirrored the dreariness she imagined lay beyond the dormer window. Rain continued to lash against the glass, and she wondered if the weather had decided to rob summer from the entire country, or if it had saved its worst to batter just Heritage Cove, the picturesque village where she lived on the east coast of England. She groaned, put the pillow over her head, and tried to block out the rumbles. Running a bakery, she was used to getting up and about early, and normally, once awake, she'd open the blind to let in the light, fling open the window to allow the smell of summer to filter in and around the top floor of the cottage. What had once been a dingy loft had gone through a conversion to give Jade and her sister Celeste 2 bedrooms and a beautiful bathroom upstairs at the home that was mere meters from their bakery business. They often laughed about their terrible commute, the 30-odd steps you had to take from the back door of the cottage to the bakery and its rear entrance. Today was supposed to be the first lie-in, the first chance to recharge. The girls had finally given the go-ahead to renovate the bakery and its kitchen space. They'd be closed for 3 weeks, so their workload would be reduced somewhat. They had a few summer function orders from businesses in the area. Some locals had put in their regular orders with the girls, unable to fathom going to the supermarket for their bread or their rolls or their cinnamon rounds, and Jade had cake orders to fulfill. She couldn't blame anyone other than herself for how rough she was feeling right now. Last night, she'd made the most of the lack of early starts at the bakery and hadn't held back in celebrating with the locals at the village pub, the Copper Plough, old and young alike, raising their glasses to the upcoming wedding of everyone's favourite septuagenarian, Barney. His fiancée, Lois, had officially sold her house in Ireland and moved to the Cove, and with every day that crept closer to the wedding, excitement was mounting, because at last they'd found their happy ending after decades apart. Jade had willingly leapt in and agreed to do the wedding cake last night, but it wasn't talk of flavours and styles that had been the problem at the pub. The real issue had been Celeste and the other girls all seeming to be determined to zone in on Jade's love life. With the entire village consumed with wedding fever, what with Barney and Lois's nuptials and the village's annual fundraising event, the wedding dress ball, taking place on the same day, it appeared everyone was focused on happy endings. And Jade could understand why. The dress code for the ball requested previously worn wedding gowns and suits, or at the very least, attire smart enough that it could be worn for the occasion. Some went for debutante dresses. Others had their own garments adjusted as the years went on and kept up the true tradition for the event, and that in itself sparked a lot of interest. With all the buzz in the village, yesterday, Jade had overheard Zara, who ran the ice creamery, telling a friend she'd met the man of her dreams. The day before, she'd been in the convenience store, and Lottie, who ran the local shop, had been pondering over who would be the next to be lucky in love in the Cove. And even Benjamin, the chef at the pub, had picked himself up again and was a bundle of positivity despite a recent messy breakup with his long-term girlfriend. Now, as Jade tried and failed to find a comfortable position in bed, she shuddered, remembering exactly why she'd become the focus last night. She'd had one too many glasses of Prosecco and had made the open admission to Melissa and anyone else in earshot that she'd fallen in love with a man not so long ago and she'd never got over him. As soon as the words were out, she'd wished she could stuff them all back in again, because she had been doing her very best to move forwards over the last 18 months. Melissa, who was engaged to be married, had then floated the idea of honeymooning in Italy. She'd been telling the girls that she and Harvey couldn't make up their minds where to go. They could go to New York in the winter months and experience Christmas there. They could go on a safari, or they could go and do Sardinia with its architecture and breathtaking turquoise waters. Melissa went on to talk about how romantic a honeymoon in Italy would be, all the places they could see, and Jade only managed to finally steer the girls away from the topic of all things Italian by talking about the wedding cake for Barney and Lois. Celeste was always happy to talk shop, so it wasn't a problem getting her to talk about something else, and Melissa, being a lover of the bakery, fell in line soon after to Jade's relief, because a mere mention of the country and the man she'd left behind had already left her feeling once again the pain of what she'd found there and lost. Jade turned over in bed to see if covering her other ear might work better to drown out the noise of the storm, but it didn't make an ounce of difference. She reached over and picked up her clock. 6 a.m. Wide-eyed, with no hope of drifting off again, she threw back the covers and lay there on her back, staring at the ceiling. Her thoughts briefly drifted to Italy, until she registered that it wasn't thunder that had woken her up and continued to disturb her, but something else. A relentless thumping that was starting to make her head hurt. She padded over to the window and lifted the blackout blind, not squinting as she usually would when the sunlight streamed in. It was still raining, but it wasn't half as gloomy out there as she'd imagined. And as she peered out, her eyes fell to the kitchen at the back of the bakery and the light coming from inside. "Seriously," she muttered. Harvey was in charge of renovating the bakery for them and had told her he'd hired someone called David to make a start today while he was busy with his main job as a loft fitter, but he'd also agreed they wouldn't start at an uncivilized hour for the first week, giving the sisters some time out. Obviously, whoever it was making the racket wasn't used to listening to a boss's instructions, and that was a red flag to Jade. Huffing and puffing, she reached for the cream cardigan hanging on the rounded handle of her wardrobe that, small in height, slotted in nicely below the eaves. The space might have been converted, but it was still quirky and characterful, and being close to 5'10", she had to watch her head in certain areas, including around the wardrobe. She didn't always manage it when she was this sleepy and irritated, and so cursed now when she banged the top of her head just as another almighty clatter made her jump. She tugged the cardigan around herself to cover the camisole top of her pyjamas and stepped out onto the landing. A bathroom and the staircase leading down separated her bedroom from her sister's, and she crept towards the half-open door and peeked in on Celeste. But Celeste was fast asleep. Growing up, Jade had never ceased to be amazed at how she could do that. She'd slept through a fire engine roaring up the road for their next-door neighbour in the early hours one bright spring morning. She'd slept through the tent blowing down in a gale on a family camping trip, their parents successfully transferring her to the car from the airbed she'd been on without her stirring, until they pulled into the driveway at home. Jade, on the other hand, had been wide awake and soaking wet as she'd helped gather everything up to shove in the car. And then, when they flew to New York for an adventure in their early 20s, Jade had spent the flight getting irritated by the passenger behind who kept kicking her seat, whilst Celeste had shut her eyes the minute they'd boarded the flight and not woken until it was time to disembark. Jade closed her sister's bedroom door quietly so at least one of them could get the rest they both needed, as yet another thump threatened to disturb the entire village's peace. She went back to her own room, where she looked out of the window again to see the back door to the bakery kitchen wide open, and what looked like a huge length of wood flying out. Good job it wasn't Harvey. She liked him, but a lackey she could handle, and she had no qualms about setting down some ground rules. Harvey obviously hadn't made it clear enough, but she would. Or maybe it was a bad idea to confront whoever it was, especially while wearing only flimsy pyjamas. She downed the glass of water by her bed and instead hunted for her phone. Perhaps it would be better to get hold of Harvey and have him lay down the law instead. But after looking in all the usual places, the bedside table, the chest of drawers, on the floor by the bed, she still couldn't find her phone. "Where is it?" she groaned, unable to find the device or even her bag. Admittedly, there were clothes strewn everywhere. She'd neatly piled fresh washing on her bed ready to put away, but chucked it all to the floor when she flopped into bed last night. She looked under the detritus on the floor, beneath the bed, in the wardrobe just in case she'd put it there. And before she could go downstairs to call her phone using the landline, she had to stop and sit on the edge of her bed as her hangover reminded her she'd planned to spend most of today sleeping it off. She didn't stay there long, however, because regardless of the noise levels and her distaste at being woken so early, she had more pressing issues. Where was her bag, her phone, and her purse? She tugged on a pair of jeans and a pink cotton shirt that tied at her midriff. She now had no choice but to go outside and confront whoever was in her bakery, and after she'd done that, she'd have to hunt down her bag and belongings. She ran her fingers through her hair to tug it into something semi-presentable. Her graduated bob was easy maintenance, and the ebony strands that fell against her face didn't take long to tame. She rinsed her mouth with mouthwash in the bathroom because, even though she'd had all that water, it still felt so dry she wasn't sure she'd be able to make conversation, and laying down the law didn't sound half as effective if your voice cracked and broke when you were midway through trying to make your point. Out the back of the cottage, Jade made a run for it in her flip-flops, neatly jumping from one paving slab to another in the hope of not getting entirely soaked. She'd almost made it to the back door when, next thing she knew, something came flying right at her. She cursed as a piece of wood whacked her on the temple. She stumbled against the open back door and didn't register someone grabbing hold of her to stop her falling completely. "Get inside out of the rain," the voice encouraged. She was so discombobulated after the wooden missile that she didn't think to question going inside with a man who was a stranger. "Can I take a look?" he asked, brow furrowed in concern as he inspected her head. She gingerly took her hand away as he stepped closer. "There's a bit of blood." He washed his hands at the sink and then opened up the first aid kit that sat on the shelf by the door. He looked at her as he fished through for what he needed. "I'll clean it up for you. I'm so sorry." "I can go back to the house and sort it myself," she said, beginning to move, but he was back beside her already. "It won't take a minute, and I'd hate for the blood to drip onto your shirt." Instead of waiting for her to make a choice, he reached up and gently dabbed her temple with a piece of damp, warm cotton wool. It was more soothing than she expected, and she forgot for a moment that she'd come in here to give him a piece of her mind. "I'm really sorry I threw the wood at you." "I'm kind of hoping it wasn't at me," she smiled, because despite the early wake-up call and the knock to the head, this man seemed kind, and she wasn't so affected by the noise or the morning-after feeling that she failed to notice the way his slightly too long-on-top hair curled in places. His tentative smile had a hint of cheekiness, and glossy ocean-blue eyes kept bringing his attention back to her. "You're right. It wasn't at you. I wasn't exactly expecting anyone to walk in at this time of the morning. I'm Jade. I own the bakery with my sister." He stopped dabbing, looked down at her and smiled. "I kind of realised that. And although I did expect to meet you today, I didn't think it would be before mid-morning because Harvey told me you and your sister were both making the most of your lie-ins." He threw the spent piece of cotton wool into a bag for rubbish plonked in the corner of the kitchen before he grimaced. "Don't tell me. You were enjoying your lie-in right up until I woke you." "Got it in one." He peeled the backings off a plaster. "Do you always disobey a direct order?" "Direct order?" He stepped forwards to place the plaster in the right spot on her temple. his fingers brushing her skin and sending a little tingle all the way through her, a welcome relief from the feeling of a growing hangover. Perhaps the whack with the piece of wood might have hurt all the more if it wasn't dulled by all the drinks, still lingering in her system from last night. That sounds dramatic. I'm not in the military. I told Harvey to tell you not to start early. He said he'd cleared it with you and that you were more than happy to start late for the first week. Never got the message. He zipped up the first aid kit. Harvey wouldn't lie, she protested, a little taken aback this man would suggest it. He wasn't proving himself to be much of an employee. He said he'd told you a couple of weeks ago. He put the first aid kit back where it came from. Then I think I see where the problem might be. You think I'm David. You're not. David was the man Harvey had put on his payroll for this job. No, I'm not. David chose to have his own lie-ins for the next 4 weeks, on holiday in America. Last-minute summons from his mates, apparently, so he let Harvey down. Seriously? He seemed amused by her dramatic summation and repeated it. Seriously. Between you and me, I don't think Harvey will be putting any work David's way again. I wouldn't either, she agreed. Harvey found me to step in at the 11th hour, but in all the organising, I guess he forgot to mention not to start early. I couldn't sleep, so I came to make a start. Right. She supposed she should be grateful someone else had been available to step in. Harvey and the firm he worked for had done such a stellar job on the cottage, converting the loft space, a job Harvey had been in charge of coordinating, that Jade and Celeste had been more than happy to employ his services for their workspace as he begun to get going with his renovations business, with a view to becoming his own boss eventually. I'm Linc. The man held out his hand to introduce himself formally. Good to meet you. Apologies again about the early start and the knock on the head. I assure you it's not always so dramatic when I meet someone new. She shook hands with him, and aware of his attention and the fact she'd only just fallen out of bed, asked when Harvey would be joining him. She wished she'd had the foresight to put some deodorant on or check how bad the dark circles were beneath her eyes. The problem with porcelain skin from the family's Irish descent was that it didn't hide much at all, especially after a big night out. I'm not sure what time Harvey will be around, said Linc. All I know is that I'm fine to go ahead and rip stuff out, supposedly the easy part. He got back to what he'd been doing, either because he had a job to do, or because he sensed her discomfort. She wasn't sure which. He threw another piece of wood from a kitchen cabinet out of the door and onto the pile in the garden that stretched between home and workplace. Do you want me to stop so you can go back to sleep? I'm awake now, she grumbled, suddenly remembering her mood when she'd come down here. He was already on to unscrewing another pine cupboard door from what had at one time housed dry ingredients in a tall pantry lined with shelves that would likely be the next casualty. And while Jade would have loved to go back to sleep, she needed to fulfill the second part of her mission, to find her bag and purse. She looked on the kitchen surfaces that had so far survived the cull. She lifted up a few pieces of stray wood, but no luck there. She could vaguely remember coming in here last night with Celeste as they talked business and recounted their plans to transform the bakery. They weren't doing away with the village feel, but nevertheless they did want to spruce up the interior and put their own stamp on the business. The frontage would remain the same, a beautiful Tudor-style exterior. They'd have the whitewashed stone facade repainted, now that it was summer. The deep timber panels could be restained, and the criss-cross glass windows that had lasted well only needed replacing in a few of the weaker or cracked sections to bring them up to scratch. Another bang reminded Jade of each glass of Prosecco last night, as Linc slung an old shelf out of the back door and it clattered to the ground with the rest of the pieces. Are you looking for something? He watched her carry out her fruitless search, even peering down the side of the cabinet that was half in, half out, as he progressed through the demolition. "I put it beneath the counter in the bakery. Your bag," he added when she regarded him suspiciously. "I thought it was better there than in full view. I found it sitting on the front counter. You're lucky someone didn't break in and grab it." She cringed. She'd left it in full view. Now that was the behaviour of someone who rarely let loose at the pub. Luckily, people around here are fairly honest. "Hey, there are thieves everywhere. You can't be too careful." His voice followed her as she went to retrieve her bag. Phone and purse were both inside, thankfully. She picked up the notepad beside it, though, and wondered if Linc had read what was on it. She had a patchy recollection of her and Celeste standing in here talking about the renovations and debating a name for the bakery, something they left rather late. They still had to inform the company making the new sign, and time was running out, as they'd need a bit of notice for it to be ready for their grand reopening. But so far nothing had come close to being right. And the list on the notepad had some downright silly ideas, some of them suggestive, others embarrassingly rude. They'd started the list with Melissa and Tilly's help at the pub. Tilly owned Tilly's Bits and Pieces, a shop a few doors down from the bakery that sold beautiful items for the home, and most of her recommendations involved the amalgamation of Jade and Celeste's names, none of which sounded right. She'd then suggested All You Need, but Melissa thought it sounded like a massage parlour, and not a respectable one. Melissa had come up with Queens of the Cove, but they'd rejected that outright, as Celeste said people would think it was run by a couple of drag queens. Another few names were already taken, according to their Google searches, and the suggestion of upper crust not only was met with someone saying it's already in use, but also had Tilly in stitches, having misheard and thought the suggestion was up, her, crust. They'd left it there, but Celeste and Jade had come back to the bakery and written down as many ideas as they could think of. But they were still no closer. With her bag on her shoulder, Jade walked back past Linc with plans to return to her bedroom for at least another hour of lying in a horizontal position, regardless of the banging. "Thanks for putting it somewhere safe," she smiled. Because she couldn't not mention it and was pretty sure he'd seen it, she added, "Excuse the list, we're not quite there yet." He briefly paused as he lifted the large door away from the corner storage cupboard where they kept the enormous bags of flour when they were delivered from the supplier, and moved to lean it against the wall. Jade supposed the door might be wanted intact, and that was why he hadn't lobbed it out along with everything else. Good job that hadn't come hurtling at her, or she'd have had more than a little graze on her temple. "Did you get the photo too?" He'd moved on to the shelving inside what had been the cupboard. His wrist rotated with the screwdriver in his hand as he released one of the fixed pieces of wood. "I found it on the floor, although I guess it might not be yours. I put it next to the bag." His voice trailed off and she went back into the front of the bakery, and from beneath the counter where her bag had been, she pulled out the black and white picture that was most definitely hers. Usually tucked in her bag, it must have fallen out when she tugged the notepad out last night in their enthusiasm to carry on dreaming up names for the renovated bakery. Sometimes it was like there were two sides to her. The woman who was together and owned and ran a business, and then the sap who couldn't get over the man she'd once fallen in love with. Jade went back through the kitchen. "I'll leave you to it then." "Boyfriend?" Linc asked, his gaze not shifting from the shelf that was taking quite a bit of strength to release from its position. The tendons in his arms twitched while he moved it this way and that, and once he'd got it, he turned and slung it out of the back door onto the pile. "Sorry, what?" "The photo," he said, screwdriver in his hand once again, multitasking as they talked. "Boyfriend, right?" "Oh, no, not anymore." "Dumped?" Was he taking the mickey out of her? Or was that usually the sort of information he demanded of someone he barely knew? Whichever it was, she didn't appreciate it, especially not this early, and especially not with a headache that lingered insistently. I don't see that that's any of your business. He looked at her then. I apologise, that was rude. She was about to at least smile politely back when he continued with, I'm right though, aren't I? Again, none of my business, he shrugged. I get it. But if you ask me, carrying a photo of your ex around with you is hardly a recipe for being happy. Yeah, well, I didn't ask you, did I? It riled her that he'd seen the photo and he'd got it in one. Carrying it around with her wasn't helping her to move on. But having that pointed out only made her feel a whole lot worse. Just keep the noise down. It's very early. And not only for us, but for the rest of the village, too. He gave her a salute which didn't go down well, and sent her marching off back to the house, hardly caring that the rain was coming down relentlessly. Her hair was so wet when she got in that she had to give it a good rub with a towel. She stomped into her bedroom, pulled down the Roman blind again, climbed into bed, and snuggled beneath a duvet. The side of her head was sore from the collision with the piece of wood, and her hangover was here to remind her that it was the last hurrah for her for a while. Because last night had not only been a celebration, it also marked the path of the way ahead for Jade. She hadn't shared it with anyone else, but she had a plan way beyond the business and dreams of what might have been. She had a way to move forwards that not everyone might approve of, but one that she'd come to terms with some time ago, and now she was ready for it. She only hoped her sister would support her in this as much as they had each other's backs with the business. Chapter 2. Why did he have to wind up the first woman he came across in the cove? He was supposed to be coming here to help, not cause trouble. Linc's auntie Etna had called him early evening yesterday, which wasn't all that unusual as they talked regularly. But this time, she'd got hold of him to ask if he wanted to come and stay with her in Heritage Cove, where she owned and ran the local tea rooms. She'd told him there was an urgent situation. A friend of hers needed help with a job renovating a bakery. A second pair of hands was the way she'd described it. As it was, Linc had been in laid-back mode given he'd wrapped up supply teaching a few weeks before the end of term, and, with not much else on the horizon, he'd agreed. And it was a bit of extra cash between jobs, which was always a good thing. He'd been to the village a handful of times over the years, though never hung around for long, but Etna had still insisted on selling it to him, rambling on about how beautiful it was, how she longed to see more of him, how staying with her would be a change of scene and the perfect antidote to his problems. It'll give you a new perspective, she told him. It'll help you to de-stress, doing something entirely different. Linc had never held a long conversation with Etna, or anyone for that matter, about his problems or misgivings, or whatever it was he wanted to call them. Because there was nothing concrete. Nothing had happened to which he could attribute his being in a rut, being all over the place, not really happy, whatever description you wanted to label it with. It wasn't that a singular thing had occurred. It was a lot of things that had built up gradually along the way, and he'd never really found his place again. This was one of the reasons he'd never taken another permanent teaching position. He didn't want the same faces, people getting to know him on a deeper level and asking him questions. He wanted to sort his head out a bit, and know what direction he was going in before anyone else asked him that question. And he wasn't quite there yet. Etna's last proclamation had been that by coming to the cove, Linc could find the person he was deep down inside. He'd laughed at that part, and told her he'd have to dig really deep to have much of an epiphany. She'd merely brushed off his sarcasm and told him she'd happily find him a very big spade to do so. And while he didn't believe this sea change would do much at all, Etna had always been able to read him better than anyone else could, and so he'd taken her up on the offer, and he'd arrived in Heritage Cove late last night. "I hope I didn't annoy any other locals," Linc told Harvey when he came into the bakery kitchen just before midday. "It was early, but I was eager to get started, and I kind of forgot the time when it gets light so early. I've never been one to laze in bed, even when it is pouring with rain." "Hey, my last guy let me down big time, so don't apologise for anything," said Harvey. "I had visions of not getting this done in time, and it's the girl's livelihood. I don't want to mess with that. So, you might have ruffled a few feathers," he added with a grin, "but there's no real harm done." Linc didn't want to mess with the bakery business either. He got the impression Jade wouldn't let them get away with much. They'd only met briefly, but already he sensed she was strong, decisive, and, he suspected, used to having the last word. "Jade will recover," Harvey assured him. "I'll smooth things over. The girls were all out last night. She's likely nursing a hangover, much like Melissa. I had to take her a cuppa in bed this morning, and she told me not to open the curtains. Not a morning person? Never was. And she's particularly bad after a late night." Harvey had brought along a heavy-duty trolley, and Linc helped him manoeuvre the largest of the two commercial ovens onto it and shift it a good few feet away from the wall, alongside the smaller one he'd already managed to move himself, so they could clean around the back. Both ovens would be removed for flooring and slotted back into position at a later date. "Another smaller oven will be delivered soon enough," Harvey told him, pointing to where it would go. "Over there, in what will be Jade's baking corner." Most of the fixtures and fittings were to be stripped out, creating one enormous space and blank canvas. But, as well as the ovens, the industrial fridge would become part of the new tapestry too. Harvey positioned himself one side of it, Linc took the other, and, using the same trolley, they shifted it out of its comfy position. Linc got on with the cleaning. A tangle of cobwebs, plenty of dust, a good few marks on the walls to add to the many others left behind once cabinetry was torn from its position. Any holes or dents would need to be filled, walls would need to be smoothed and clean, all in preparation for a spanking new kitchen. There was a certain therapy in physical labour that Linc wasn't used to, and it stopped his mind brewing any issues that lingered. It helped him forget he'd ever had anything to worry about. As they worked, they talked, too, about how Harvey hoped to build up a portfolio of renovation projects, and therefore his reputation, as well as those all-important contacts necessary for when you had your own business. Linc added the final pieces of old wood from the set of drawers by the door to the pile outside that he'd at last covered in tarp. He'd been so into the job that he hadn't thought to do that earlier when it was teeming down with rain, but after watching Jade head back to her cottage, he'd dragged the sturdy covering from the outside shed Harvey had commandeered for their time renovating. The girls didn't use it, apparently, and it was conveniently situated at the side of the garden for them to house whatever they needed. Linc had Harvey help him with the countertop that had been next to the second of the commercial ovens. The edge didn't want to come loose, and it took both of them to prise it off with the use of a chisel and a bit of strength, the wood disintegrating partway through and leaving behind the section of it that was much harder to remove. No wonder the bakery was in need of a renovation. It was only up close you could see that, although the kitchen might be operational, it was old and battered. The floor had taken some abuse along the way too, with stains and areas that were damaged and likely a tripping hazard. Once they'd slung the last of the countertops outside, Harvey asked Linc how he was settling in. "I only got here yesterday, and I've visited before, but it's nice to be staying with Etna." "I imagine she's a good host." "She looks after her guests, for sure, and it'll be good to have a change from the norm, spend a bit of time so close to the sea." Despite the cooler temperature after the humidity of late June, Linc had worked up a sweat in the kitchen, no matter that the door and the windows had been flung open the entire time. He refilled his water bottle at the tap as Harvey took a call. The window man is coming later this afternoon," Harvey said once he ended the call. "He'll give us a quote for replacing a couple of panels in the latticed glass at the front of the shop." "I'll keep an ear out for him and let him in." "Do you have to go?" "Was it me checking my watch that gave the game away?" Harvey smiled. "I've only got an hour for lunch and I need to get back to a property to take a delivery of floor joists. But don't worry, I've got plenty of scheduled time here over the next few weeks, and I'll be around evenings and weekends to get the job done. Just not today." "Your boss doesn't mind this working on the side?" He shook his head. "I've always been very honest about it, and he knows I'm trying to get my own business off the ground eventually. He's a great guy, understanding. But I think he also knows if work was quiet for me on the renovation front, then I'd always jump back in on any jobs he has, so maybe it'll work both ways." Linc wished he was as settled in a career. He'd been a teacher for a long time, and while he liked the variety of supply teaching, moving here and there depending on where he was needed, he knew the avoidance of a permanent role was part of his problem. He'd wanted to let loose, but in a controlled way. He was a grown-up, after all, and couldn't throw everything away just because his head had been a bit all over the place for a time after his mum's illness, his failed relationship and his dad's health scare. Mind you, sometimes it had been tempting, especially when some of his mates erred more on the side of irresponsibility and didn't seem ever to think long-term. Perhaps that was what innocence gave you. But when life delivered a few hard knocks, it forced you into being a little more realistic, recognising that the future was a vast, open space and you could be pulled in any direction. Harvey picked up his keys to make a move. "It looks pretty grim in here without the cabinets and with nothing on the walls." "Blank canvas, remember?" "Would you mind continuing with the cleaning up?" "I'm working for you, of course I don't mind. And don't worry, I'm not about to do a runner. I've got it too good at Etna's place for a start." "You read my mind. And thank you, it would be great if you didn't." He whistled as he took in some of the grime on the walls. "I suppose it's only to be expected in a food joint, all that baking over the years. Any more stuff you might need for serious cleaning is in the shed," said Harvey. "And before I go, I'll see Jade." Linc realised he'd been hoping his new boss might say that. "I'd appreciate it." Harvey checked his watch again. "I'd say it's safe, given it's officially the afternoon. She'll be fine. And I'll explain that while it's nice to give her a lie-in, I need to have you working as many hours as possible at this stage. The last thing I want is to get behind." "I get the impression you'll be talking her language. And suits me too. I hate leaving things until the last minute, too much pressure." "I think we're going to get along just fine." And with that, he waved a cheery goodbye. When Harvey left, Linc went out to the shed to get a big bucket and a mop that was clearly brand new and wouldn't have its fresh cream strands of thick cotton on the head for long. He found a box of cleaning solution, sponges and cloths, as well as a scrubbing brush that looked strong enough for the more brutal stains. But after he'd taken it all into the kitchen, he realised the whole place needed a damn good sweep first and went back for the broom. Linc had been tackling the floor, sweeping, scooping up dirt and throwing it out, then sweeping some more, for a good hour before Etna swung in through the back door armed with an afternoon tea fit for a team of 10 workers rather than just him. But he was more than ready for it. "You're spoiling me," he told her after washing his hands at the sink that was to stay in place in the kitchen, the metal sturdy and undamaged and perfectly fit to fight another decade or so, he suspected. "I'm allowed. It's lovely to have you here." Etna was more than 10 years older than his dad, but to Linc, she'd always seemed so much younger than her 72 years. She still had the same cropped grey hair he'd seen her with in photographs over the last couple of decades, and it suited her now that it was growing a bit longer around the sides. It made her seem younger. Perhaps her secrets to staying youthful were being her own boss, eating good food like this bacon roll with all the trimmings she'd brought him, and, not having a family to race around after. Maybe this was the winning formula. He wondered if he'd ever find his. Good? She asked him as he bit into a soft roll filled with bacon, eggs, mushrooms, and lashings of HP sauce. He nodded to show his appreciation and gestured to the other supplies Etna had brought with her, lined up on the windowsill. There was a see-through plastic container filled with colourful fruit salad, a jumbo sausage roll wrapped in a serviette, and a tub of yoghurt, sitting alongside an extra-tall latte. Exactly how much do you think I need feeding? He laughed when his mouth wasn't full, although he soon bit into another piece of the bacon roll, a salty taste too Moorish to neglect. My memories of you growing up involved your dad saying you ate him out of house and home, she laughed, thoroughly enjoying the moment. He used to tell me how he'd go to the supermarket and no sooner had he unpacked than you'd fill up on whatever was there and he'd be adding things to his list for the week after. I've grown up a lot since those days, Linc smiled. It didn't stop me stocking up my own fridge and pantry in preparation. Ah, that explains all the food shoved in the cupboards with the mugs, more beneath the sink where you keep the detergent, even more in the Welsh dresser in the lounge. It's like you're stashing in case the supermarket suddenly closed for a month. He'd given her money for his keep. She'd not wanted it, said he was a guest. But he knew his appetite, and she wasn't responsible for him. He didn't want to be living off her, no matter that it was only for a few weeks over the summer. He might have made a mess of a lot of things, but not his finances. I get very few visitors, so when I do, I like to spoil them. I suppose I can't argue with that. This opportunity had come at the right time, before he'd even realised he needed it. He'd been happily going about his days as though there was no alternative, living close enough to his dad that if he needed him, Linc could be there in less than 15 minutes. But lately he'd got the impression his dad was beginning to feel smothered, or at least responsible for Linc not quite being the together man he'd once been. His dad had suggested he go on holiday for the 6 weeks that schools weren't in session, tried to convince him to go somewhere hot and have a real break, but Linc had known he'd worry too much if he did, and so he hadn't booked anything. 7 months ago, Linc's dad had had what they termed a mild heart attack, but there'd been nothing mild about it in Linc's opinion, and since then he'd watched his dad like a hawk. He'd already lost one parent. He wasn't ready to lose another. But rather than easing things for his dad, Linc knew he'd become a bit too attentive. He'd been fussing, and despite being aware he was doing it, he couldn't stop. Linc knew, too, that sometimes he wasn't pleasant to be around. He was miserable, angry on occasion, and even he was starting to not want to spend time with himself. He was carrying a frustration, a sense of loss and lack of direction that he knew he took out on the people around him, and he didn't know how to move on from it. Linc had wondered briefly whether his dad had begged his sister to do something. Who knew? Perhaps they'd even paid off this David to do a runner and let Linc come to the cove for work instead. No more, he groaned after demolishing the bacon roll, a bit of fruit, and Etna tried to push the yoghurt towards him. I won't be able to bend down to rip out any more of the cabinets if I put anything else in my stomach. The coffee will do, though, he winked. Etna definitely enjoyed being the one to look after everyone else. It was why she was suited to a business that saw her running around serving others and bringing joy to their day with snacks and beverages and the art of conversation. He'd often thought she'd missed out by never being a mum. She would have been a good one too, ruled with an iron fist, but with the perfect balance between discipline and love. But it wasn't something she'd ever talked about, and why would she with her nephew? It was every woman's, and every man's, for that matter, right to choose whether they wanted to be a parent or not. Etna had never found anyone else after Linc's Uncle Wyatt died over 25 years ago either. She must have been in her mid-40s when she became a widow. But, to Linc's knowledge, there had been nobody since. She had the business, and it seemed that had always been more than enough. Etna, unprompted, gave him another rundown of who lived in the cove. Not Heritage Cove. It seemed locals dropped the heritage part, and he was fast getting used to doing the same. He now knew who all the business owners were, the frequent visitors to the tea rooms, and all about the upcoming wedding plans for local man Barney and his fiancée Lois. Jade will do the wedding cake, Etna told him, and the catering team is Tracy, who runs the Heritage Inn, the guest house on the corner as you come into the village, Celeste from this bakery, and me. Barney loves nothing more than to keep things local where we can. You should get amongst it while you're here. Being bossy was another quality she had down to a T, but he didn't mind a bit. What are you suggesting? I offer to be an usher at the wedding. Not quite. But make sure you don't hide yourself away in here. Get out and about. Take in the fresh air and the scenery. Get to know the locals. That's why I keep telling you about them. I've already been doing that by upsetting Jade. He explained about the early start this morning. He didn't tell her he'd found the photograph and teased her about an ex-boyfriend she was clearly still hung up on. I find an apology usually works, Lincoln. No need to full name me, but you're probably right. And he expected it was a better approach than winding her up. He knew he'd been an idiot. But being wronged by a woman did that to a man sometimes. It was difficult to separate the good ones from the ones who might be out to take you for a ride. Harvey said he'd have a word, and when I next see her, I will apologise, I promise. Glad to hear it. She patted him on the knee as though he were 10 years old. You should walk down to the cove one day, too. Walk on the sand, see the water. It's magnificent. It's almost a local hideaway, accessed via a track beside the chapel. Or there's the pub quiz, she added, barely pausing for breath. There'll be plenty taking part, all ages too, and Harvey is a frequent flyer as well as a frequent winner. I'm not a released prisoner, you know. He knocked back the rest of his coffee, a welcome bitterness after the tangy roll. You don't have to integrate me back into society. What has Dad been telling you exactly? He doesn't tell tales. I know you, remember? I want you to have a good summer. Sort your head out. Because any fool can tell you're not quite right and haven't been for some time. She patted his knee once again. Nobody, including me, will push you if you don't want to know, but at the same time it wouldn't harm you to make an effort and find some friends. Whatever you've got going on, and I don't need to know the details if you don't want to talk about it, you need to make the most of your time here. Are you trying to get me out from under your feet? Her place wasn't exactly big, and he was aware how easy it would be to get in the way. Don't be daft. There's only one of me, and I work all the hours I can anyway. You're never going to retire, are you? Not if I can help it. She pushed her hands against her thighs and stood up. For someone in her 70s, she moved well. She had to, with a job like hers. Perhaps that was another...